Jackson Reed had exactly half a sandwich left when he saw a woman shivering outside his garage. Without hesitation, the single father tore his lunch in two and handed her the larger piece, asking nothing in return. The next morning, a wall of engines shattered the quiet street. 6 gleaming black cars surrounded his small house, men in dark suits stepping out. Then the same woman from yesterday emerged, dressed now in tailored power instead of torn wool, but she had not come to repay a kindness. She had come because Jackson held a secret that could save her empire. Stay with this story to the end to see how one small act of kindness quietly rewrote 2 lives overnight. Jackson Reed woke before sunrise in the small house attached to Reed Motor Works, the way he had every morning since his wife died. He made coffee in the same chipped pot, checked the day's repair schedule pinned to the wall, and let his eyes rest for a moment on the photograph propped against the window frame. His late wife smiled out from behind the glass, her hair caught mid-laugh in a summer that felt like it belonged to another man's life. Beside her photograph sat another one, a girl in a school uniform grinning with a missing front tooth. His daughter was staying with her aunt for a few days while he caught up on a backlog of repairs, and though the house felt quieter without her, he had learned to carry that particular silence without letting it show. A short message waited on his phone when he checked it over coffee. His daughter had finished her homework and wanted him to remember to eat lunch. A small line that told him more than she probably realized about how well she understood her father's habits. He typed back that he had already packed a sandwich, which was technically true, even if the sandwich in question was thin, made from the last heel of bread in the house, and paired with coffee poured from a thermos that had seen better decades. The garage itself was not much to look at from the outside, a low building with a hand-painted sign and a gravel lot that never quite dried out after rain. Inside, though, everything had its place. Tools hung in careful rows, invoices were filed by date rather than left in a drawer, and the concrete floor was swept clean enough that customers sometimes joked they could eat off it. People in town trusted Jackson because he never charged for work that did not need doing, a rare enough quality that his small shop stayed busy through word of mouth alone. An older woman brought in her sedan that morning, worried because a warning light had come on and stayed on. Jackson listened to the engine for less than a minute before popping the hood and finding a loose sensor connector, nothing more. He reseated it, cleared the code, and waved off her offer to pay for the diagnostic, telling her the whole job had taken him 5 minutes and did not deserve a bill. She left grateful and a little bewildered, the way most of his customers did, unused to a mechanic who told them the truth even when a lie would have been more profitable. Later that morning, while he worked beneath a pickup truck, Jackson caught the distinct whine of a high-performance engine somewhere out on the highway beyond the tree line. He paused, wrench still in hand, and listened more carefully than the sound seemed to warrant. Something in the rhythm of the cooling pump was off, a stutter that most ears would never register but that his had been trained to catch years ago. He murmured to himself that they still had not fixed it, a remark that meant nothing to anyone else in the garage and everything to him. On his workbench, tucked beneath a stack of invoices, sat an old leather-bound notebook filled with technical sketches. Whenever a customer walked in, Jackson closed it without a word and slid it out of sight, a habit so automatic he barely noticed himself doing it anymore. By midday, he locked the garage door for a short break, sat on the back steps, and finally reached for the single sandwich he had packed that morning. Before he could take the first bite, he noticed a woman curled against the fence at the edge of the lot, and everything about the rest of his day changed. The woman wore a thin sweater stained at the elbows, her hair tangled from wind, her shoes crusted with mud, and a fresh cut visible across one knuckle. Jackson noticed her before she noticed him, and something about her did not fit the picture she seemed to be presenting. She did not carry herself like someone who had lived rough for years. Her posture stayed straight even while she shivered. Her eyes moved across the lot with a wariness that felt trained rather than desperate. And despite the mud, her shoes were the kind built by hand rather than bought off a rack. He did not point out any of it. Instead, he asked simply whether she needed him to call anyone. She looked at him for a long moment before answering that she was not sure who she could still trust. She gave only her first name, Amelia, offering nothing more, and Jackson did not press for details he sensed she was not ready to give. He brought her a cup of warm water and gestured toward a chair near the space heater inside the garage. She hesitated before stepping through the doorway, glancing back toward the road more than once, as though watching for a particular vehicle that might round the corner at any moment. Through fragments she let slip without meaning to, a picture began to form of where her morning had gone wrong. She had left a closed-door meeting with an outside auditor only hours earlier, one where she had confirmed her worst suspicion about the company she ran. A senior executive had quietly altered the specifications for a cooling system across an entire line of luxury electric vehicles, cutting costs in a way that pushed the batteries dangerously close to a failure point under heavy strain. On the drive back, her escort vehicle had been forced off the road by another car, her driver injured but stable, and Amelia had slipped out through a rear door and disappeared into an industrial side street before anyone could follow. She still carried, tucked against her body, a small drive containing the audit data that had confirmed everything. She had no idea who inside her own company might have arranged the ambush, which meant she did not dare use a public phone or reveal her location to anyone she could not verify by sight. Her coat, her purse, and her phone had all been lost somewhere between the crash and the fence line where Jackson had found her. Back in the garage, Jackson noticed the faint red mark across her wrist where a seatbelt had cut into skin, and the particular shade of reddish mud on her shoes that only collected near the bridge on the north side of town. He understood, without needing her to explain it, that she had survived something violent within the last few hours. Still, he did not push for the story. He simply set a first aid kit on the table in front of her and let her decide what to do with it. The gesture caught her off guard more than she expected. In the world she moved through, every kindness came wrapped around an expectation, a favor owed, a photograph taken, a story sold later for advantage. Jackson found none of that. He did not know who she was, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, he was not trying to find out what he might get from her in return. Amelia's eyes settled on the sandwich in Jackson's hand, and she asked, almost apologetically, whether he had anything else to eat. He told her he had already eaten a large breakfast, a lie so smooth it barely registered as one, and then tore the sandwich in half anyway, handing her the larger piece without ceremony. She caught the lie for exactly what it was but chose not to call attention to it. Instead, she asked whether he made a habit of sharing his lunch with strangers. He answered that he did not, only when a stranger seemed to need it more than he did. It was a small exchange, plainly spoken, but it settled something between them that neither one tried to name out loud. While they ate, Amelia noticed a small metal component sitting on his workbench, recently removed from an older sports car. Jackson explained briefly that it was a thermal regulation valve, nothing unusual for the kind of work he did. Without thinking, she asked a technical question that went far deeper than casual curiosity would allow, and Jackson glanced up sharply, because a woman living on the street should not know that particular vocabulary. She covered the slip by claiming she had once worked on a factory floor, and he let the explanation stand even though it did not quite fit. At that exact moment, a Meridian Apex passed on the road outside, its cooling system giving off a faint, almost imperceptible rattle. Jackson stopped eating and turned his head toward the sound. He picked up a paper napkin, sketched 3 valves, 2 heat pathways, and a single bottleneck in the distribution line, and explained without any prompting that the manufacturer had placed its sensor too far from the actual heat source. The software, he said, would register a warning roughly 17 seconds late. In an ordinary car, 17 seconds would mean nothing. In a battery built for extreme performance, it could be the difference between a safe shutdown and a fire. Amelia went very still because the flaw he had just described matched, almost word for word, the exact failure her audit team had uncovered days earlier. Worse still, he had sketched a working solution in a matter of minutes, something her own engineering department had failed to produce in months. She asked for his full name. When he told her Jackson Reed, something about it felt familiar, though she could not yet place where she had seen it before. Jackson sensed she was holding something back, but his manner toward her did not change because of it. He let her use the small washroom to clean up, found a spare work jacket that was reasonably clean, and offered her the key to a small guest room behind the garage that he sometimes used for overnight jobs. She hesitated, worried about pulling danger into his quiet life. He told her simply that she could leave at first light, but the night outside was not safe for her right now. Before stepping into the room, Amelia quietly activated an emergency locator hidden inside the face of a broken watch, sending an encoded signal to her head of security, a man named Mason Carter. The scene shifted briefly to a security command center miles away, where a single red dot appeared on a monitor. Mason rose from his chair immediately, calling out that they had finally found her. Jackson woke the next morning to a sound that did not belong on his street, a deep, layered growl of engines rolling in from every direction at once. He stepped outside and found 6 high-performance vehicles in black, silver, and deep red parked along the length of his small property, each one worth more than everything he owned combined. Neighbors pulled back their curtains to look, and a few stepped onto their porches holding up phones to capture the scene. Men in dark suits climbed out of the vehicles and spread across the lot, wearing earpieces and scanning every window of the garage with practiced attention. Jackson's first assumption was that Amelia might be a witness to something dangerous, an heir running from a threat, or a woman fleeing an organization with far more resources than good intentions. Whatever the truth was, it clearly involved people who did not travel lightly. A man who introduced himself as Mason Carter stepped forward and asked Jackson to move away from the garage door. Jackson did not retreat. He stated plainly that the woman inside was safe and that he would not hand her over to anyone until she confirmed for herself who these people were. Mason paused, visibly surprised that an ordinary mechanic could stay this composed while surrounded by his entire security detail. Tension climbed as 2 of the men started toward the entrance. Jackson stepped in front of the door, making no move toward violence but making it unmistakably clear that no one would be walking past him into a place where a frightened woman had spent the night. Then the door opened from the inside. Amelia stepped out wearing clothing her assistants had rushed to the back entrance only minutes earlier, a long cream-colored coat over a dark-tailored suit, her hair restored to its usual polish, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. She ordered the men to stand down immediately, adding that this man had protected her when none of them had even been able to find her. Mason apologized to Jackson at once. One of the assistants addressed Amelia formally, calling her Miss Hayes, and Jackson finally understood that the woman he had shared his lunch with the day before was Amelia Hayes, the chief executive he had occasionally seen quoted in business coverage, the owner of every vehicle currently parked outside his garage. Rather than react to her wealth, Jackson simply asked whether she had been hurt anywhere. The question moved her more than she expected it to, because he was speaking to her exactly the way he had the night before, not like a billionaire, but like a person. She returned the work jacket, carefully folded, and inside its pocket was the paper napkin he had used to sketch the cooling system the day before. She asked where he had learned that kind of knowledge. Jackson deflected, calling it old experience and nothing more. When Amelia offered to pay him for the meal in the room, Jackson refused outright, telling her he had shared his lunch with Amelia, not with the chief executive of Hayes Meridian. She understood then that money would never be the currency that earned this man's trust. Just before she left, her gaze caught on an old metal plate mounted inside the garage, engraved with a name and a title, and the sight of it pulled loose a memory she had almost forgotten. Jackson Reed was the engineer who had vanished from her company's records years earlier. On the ride back to headquarters, Amelia asked her general counsel, Lisa Morgan, to pull every record connected to Jackson Reed. The official file described him as a mid-level contract engineer who had walked away from the company after his first project failed to deliver, a summary that struck Amelia as thin the moment she read it. She kept replaying the way he had diagnosed a cooling system by sound alone, the way he had sketched a working solution on a napkin faster than her own engineering team had managed in weeks. A person with that kind of ability did not simply drift away as a forgettable mid-level hire. Lisa dug further and found a cluster of archived files that had once been flagged for deletion. Inside them were older messages showing that Jackson had actually led the company's thermal control program years earlier. The name attached to the approval for erasing those files belonged to Cameron Blake. Meanwhile, back at the garage, Jackson opened an old metal box containing documents from his years at Hayes Meridian. The story behind them unfolded slowly. He had once been a rising young engineer who built a valve capable of reacting to sudden heat changes faster than any standard electronic system. At the time, his wife had been fighting a serious illness, and Jackson had asked for flexible hours so he could care for her and their young daughter. Cameron had taken advantage of a moment when Jackson was exhausted and stretched thin, pressuring him into signing paperwork under the promise that his position would remain protected. After his wife passed away, the company announced that the project had been canceled and quietly accused Jackson of missing deadlines he had never actually missed. He had no fight left in him by then. He left the industry entirely, gave up his apartment in the city, and moved his small family to Millbrook, keeping his original design drawings but never pursuing legal action, unwilling to raise his daughter inside a courtroom battle. Back in the present, Amelia returned to the garage that evening without the usual convoy, only Mason waiting quietly outside. She laid the paper napkin on the workbench and asked directly whether he was the one who had designed what her records now called the Reed Thermal Gate. Jackson said nothing at first. She showed him a photo of the cooling assembly currently installed in the Meridian apex, and the central component was nearly identical to his own design. Jackson immediately recognized that Cameron had copied his work but swapped the heat-resistant alloy for a cheaper substitute. He warned her that the apex line did not only have a software problem. The body of the valve itself could warp under sustained maximum output. Amelia asked what the worst outcome could look like. Jackson answered plainly that a single car catching fire would only be the beginning. If thousands of units had already shipped, she was staring down a recall large enough to break the company. Amelia revealed that the largest delivery wave was scheduled to begin in only 3 days. Jackson understood immediately that they had almost no time left to act. Amelia asked Jackson to come to headquarters and personally inspect the Apex prototype. He refused immediately. He wanted nothing to do with Cameron, and he had no interest in being used to save a company only to be discarded again once the crisis had passed. Amelia told him she was not asking him to rescue a stock price. She was asking him to help stop innocent drivers from being placed in danger. That argument reached something deeper in Jackson than any appeal to loyalty could have. Still, he laid out 3 conditions before agreeing to anything. Every test would be filmed and stored independently of the company's own servers. Lisa Morgan would be present as legal counsel throughout. And if any danger was confirmed, Amelia would halt delivery immediately, regardless of what the board wanted. Amelia agreed to all 3 without hesitation. She went further, offering to sign an agreement guaranteeing that Jackson would retain ownership of any new designs he developed during the investigation. Jackson was caught off guard because it was something the company had never once offered him during his years there. Before making his final decision, Jackson received a short call from his daughter. She was not present for any of this, only a voice on the line asking whether her father was okay. Jackson looked at Amelia and told his daughter he had to fix an old problem that had been left unresolved for far too long. She answered simply that he should fix it the right way this time. The call lasted only a few sentences, but it was enough to remind Jackson that he did not want his daughter growing up believing that good people were supposed to stay quiet in the face of injustice. Jackson agreed to come to headquarters. Cameron was notified and objected immediately, arguing that Jackson was a disgruntled former employee with no standing to enter a research facility. Amelia used her authority as chief executive to overrule him outright. Behind the scenes, Cameron quietly instructed a subordinate to erase old testing records and prepare a file designed to shift technical blame onto Jackson. He also sent someone to the garage to search for the box containing Jackson's original design documents. Mason spotted an unfamiliar vehicle parked near Jackson's property and had his team intercept a man attempting to force open the rear door of the garage. The man carried a contractor badge tied to a company linked to Cameron. The incident confirmed that this was no longer a simple technical disagreement. Before leaving for headquarters, Jackson opened the metal box one more time and removed a leather-bound notebook. The first page carried his signature, a date, and a complete record of the development process behind the Reed Thermal Gate. It was evidence Cameron had never managed to erase. Jackson arrived at Hayes Meridian headquarters in his old pickup truck, still wearing his charcoal work shirt, faded jeans, and work boots. Amelia's polished fleet pulled in beside him, a contrast that seemed to draw every eye in the parking area. Employees and members of the press had already gathered outside ahead of the company's scheduled announcement for the Apex line. Several recognized Jackson from footage circulating of the supercars surrounding his house in Millbrook, and rumors were already spreading that he had somehow rescued Amelia from a kidnapping, or that the chief executive was secretly rewarding him for some unnamed favor. Cameron deliberately scheduled a technical review meeting with the full board, investors, and department heads in attendance, hoping to embarrass Jackson in front of an audience large enough to guarantee his humiliation would spread. As Jackson entered the testing lab, Cameron looked him over and remarked, loud enough for the room to hear, that they were entrusting the company's future to a mechanic from a roadside garage. A few board members laughed quietly. Jackson did not respond to the remark. He asked instead to see the raw thermal data. Cameron handed over a processed summary in which every reading appeared perfectly safe. Jackson noticed a consistent, evenly spaced gap running through the data. Every time the temperature crossed a critical threshold, the system failed to log anything for exactly 17 seconds. This was not an equipment error, it was a filter deliberately programmed to hide the warning window. Cameron insisted Jackson was speculating. Jackson proposed testing a live apex unit directly on the dynamometer. He removed the valve assembly and used a precision gauge to reveal a nearly invisible deformation. The alloy stamped into the part bore a completely different material code than the one specified in the original design. Cameron pivoted, accusing Jackson of stealing company designs during his prior employment. It was the sharpest public humiliation of the entire confrontation. He projected an old personnel file onto the screen showing that Jackson had been terminated years earlier for failing to complete assigned work and removing confidential material from the premises. Jackson placed the leather-bound notebook on the table, but did not open it yet. Lisa announced that the personnel file bore clear signs of having been altered long after the date Jackson actually left the company. Amelia demanded that Cameron explain himself. He deflected instead, suggesting that Amelia was letting personal gratitude cloud her business judgment, referencing the fact that she had spent a night at Jackson's garage and implying an improper relationship. Jackson stood to leave, unwilling to let Amelia's reputation absorb damage on his account. Amelia stopped him. In front of the entire board, she stated plainly that Mr. Reed had asked for no money, no title, and no favor. He had shared half his lunch with her when he believed she had nothing at all. The only person in the room trying to profit from this situation, she said, was the man trying to keep him silent. The room fell completely quiet. Amelia ordered all data locked down and suspended Cameron's access immediately. Cameron only smiled, because he knew a live demonstration of the Apex was scheduled within hours. If the car performed flawlessly, Jackson would look like a liar. If it failed, Cameron had already prepared falsified evidence to place the blame squarely on Jackson's interference. Mason traced the contracting company tied to the man who had tried to break into Jackson's garage and found that it belonged to Cameron's brother-in-law. Lisa followed a trail of payments to the supplier providing the cheaper alloy and discovered that over several years, Cameron had quietly received millions of dollars funneled back to him through a chain of shell companies. The original plan had been simple enough. Cameron would use Jackson's design but substitute a cheaper material to widen the profit margin. When thermal failures began surfacing during testing, he ordered the software team to conceal the dangerous 17-second gap in the data. A young engineer who objected to the cover-up had been fired and forced to sign a strict confidentiality agreement to keep him quiet. Amelia realized she had personally signed several reports Cameron had prepared without ever reading the underlying raw data herself. The discovery left her shaken, aware that some portion of the responsibility rested with her as well. She admitted to Jackson that after her father passed away, she had focused so intensely on proving she could run the company that she had handed Cameron far too much authority, largely because he always delivered numbers that looked impressive on paper. Jackson did not offer her empty comfort. He told her that her mistake had been trusting the wrong person, and that what would define her now was what she chose to do with the truth she finally had. The moment marked a real shift in how they saw one another. Jackson did not put Amelia on a pedestal, but he no longer judged her solely by her title either. In the lab, Jackson worked alongside a small group of honest engineers to review the system again from the ground up. He discovered that Cameron had pushed a remote software update the night before, one designed to keep the system running at full power even after sensors detected abnormal heat, ensuring the car would appear flawless during the investor demonstration. Jackson warned that if the test proceeded, the battery could ignite. Amelia immediately ordered the demonstration canceled. Cameron, however, had already used his board authority to send the prototype out onto the test track before her cancellation could be confirmed. A veteran test driver was already behind the wheel, with hundreds of guests and journalists gathered around the track. Cameron had positioned Amelia in a corner where stopping the event risked collapsing investor confidence entirely, regardless of what she chose to do. Jackson watched the live data feed and saw the temperature beginning to climb. The central dashboard still displayed a calm green status hidden behind the 17-second filter. He told Amelia to stop the car remotely. Cameron had already disabled her override authority. Mason recovered security footage showing Cameron entering the server room shortly before Amelia had been ambushed on the road, though they still needed to prevent an accident before that evidence could be used publicly. Jackson realized the Apex still retained a manual override port within the cooling system, a leftover piece from his own original design. Reaching it would require a technician to physically approach the car the moment it pulled into the pit lane between laps. Jackson grabbed a toolkit and started walking toward the track. Amelia caught his arm, worried that Cameron wanted exactly this, a chance to make Jackson the one who took the blame. Jackson answered simply that if he did not go, the driver might not get the chance to walk away at all. The Apex tore around the track at full speed while the crowd applauded, unaware that the temperature inside the battery pack was climbing steadily with every lap. Jackson watched the raw graph on an engineer's tablet, calculating that the car had perhaps 2 laps left before it crossed a threshold it could not come back from. Amelia ordered the track crew to raise a warning flag. Cameron tried to stall, insisting Jackson's warning had not been verified. Amelia grabbed a radio herself and ordered the driver directly into the pit lane. The car rolled to a stop. No smoke had appeared yet, but the floor panel beneath it was already dangerously hot. Jackson had less than a minute. He pulled back the access panel, reached the valve assembly, and discovered that Cameron had welded a pin into the manual override port that had never been part of the original design. Jackson cut through it, rotated the valve into emergency circulation mode, and ordered the third battery module disconnected immediately. The temperature kept climbing for a full 17 seconds before it finally began to fall. Cameron shouted that Jackson had sabotaged the prototype and demanded security place him under restraint. Mason did not move to comply. At the exact 17-second mark, the temperature dropped and the cooling system stabilized, the fire risk fully contained. The full data feed appeared live on the screens above the track for the assembled press and board members to see. Jackson pointed to 2 overlapping lines on the graph, the true reading in red and the filtered report in green. The gap between them measured exactly 17 seconds. Lisa presented falsified invoices, supplier contracts, and server access logs tied directly to Cameron. Mason played footage showing Cameron's associates pursuing Amelia's vehicle and attempting to seize the audit drive she had been carrying. Cornered, Cameron accused Jackson and Amelia of staging the entire event to seize control of the company for themselves. Jackson opened the leather-bound notebook. Every page carried a date, a witness signature, and drawings of the Reed thermal gate that predated Cameron's own patent filing by many months. An older engineer rose from the crowd and confirmed he had once worked alongside Jackson and had been pressured into silence by Cameron years earlier. Cameron tried to leave the track but was stopped by Mason. Police and federal investigators were already waiting outside after Lisa had forwarded the corruption files ahead of the demonstration. Cameron was arrested on charges of corporate fraud, theft of intellectual property, tampering with safety systems, and involvement in the ambush against Amelia. Before he was led away, he turned to Jackson and told him he could have been a millionaire years ago. Jackson answered simply that he would rather lose the money than become a man like him. Amelia walked out to face the press. Rather than hide the crisis, she announced an immediate halt to all Apex deliveries and a voluntary recall of every test unit already on the road. The stock might fall, she said, but no customer would ever pay for this failure with their life. Jackson looked at her and for the first time saw not simply an heir to an empire, but a leader finally becoming worthy of it. In the days following the arrest, the board opened an independent investigation. Jackson's name was formally restored across every record connected to the development of the Reed thermal gate, and the company publicly acknowledged that his invention had been used without his consent. Jackson was offered a substantial settlement along with ongoing royalties for every vehicle built using his design. He refused to accept a check meant to close the matter quietly. Instead, he insisted the agreement include a public apology to every engineer Cameron had pressured into silence, the creation of a fund to protect future whistleblowers, scholarships for technicians training at trade schools, a requirement that all safety testing be stored independently going forward, and a firm rule that no employee would ever again be permitted to hide data to protect a stock price. Amelia agreed to every condition. At the press conference that followed, she did not stand alone in front of the company logo. She invited Jackson and the engineers who had once been forced out to join her on stage. She told the room plainly that the company had not been saved by an expensive fleet of vehicles. It had been saved by a man willing to share half his lunch when he had nothing left to gain from it. She offered Jackson the position of vice president overseeing safety and innovation. He did not accept right away. He wanted to keep running his garage and preserve a steady life for his daughter. Eventually, the two of them settled on an arrangement where Jackson kept full ownership of Reed Motor Works while serving as lead consultant 3 days each week. The company funded a new technical training center built beside his garage, though Jackson insisted it not carry his own name. He named it instead after his late wife, a quiet way of honoring the person who had always believed in his talent long before anyone else did. The same fleet of supercars that had once surrounded his small house turned her to Millbrook, no longer as a show of power but as part of the very first safety inspection program Jackson personally led. Local reporters asked whether he felt any bitterness toward the years he had spent invisible to the industry he once helped shape. Jackson answered that bitterness had never fixed a single engine and it would not fix a company either. What mattered now was making sure no other driver ever depended on a system built to hide the truth from the people responsible for catching it. Amelia stood nearby during the interview, saying little, letting him speak in his own plain words rather than smoothing them into something more polished for the cameras. Behind the scenes, Lisa worked to ensure the settlement carried real enforcement weight rather than becoming another document that gathered dust in a filing cabinet. She built independent oversight into the company's safety division, answerable to no single executive, so that no future Cameron could quietly bury a warning again. Mason, for his part, requested a permanent transfer to oversee protection for whistleblowers rather than executives, a decision that surprised no one who had watched him stand his ground outside Jackson's garage on that first chaotic morning. 6 months later, the Reed Technical Center opened its doors for good. Young mechanics and former factory workers trained there free of charge, and Jackson still wore the same worn work shirts, still knelt beside engines to show a student exactly where a problem lived rather than simply telling them. Amelia visited often, usually without any large escort, driving an ordinary sedan and carrying coffee for whoever happened to be working late. Their relationship grew slowly, built across long shifts, quiet conversations after closing, and a steady mutual respect that neither one rushed. Jackson was never pulled toward her wealth, and Amelia never tried to reshape the life he had built. She learned to listen to the workers on the floor instead of only reading reports about them, and Jackson slowly allowed himself to believe that not everyone in her world resembled the man who had once tried to erase him. His daughter remained a quiet presence at the edges of the story, mentioned only in passing. Jackson liked to say she had grown fond of Amelia mainly because Amelia always remembered to bring the right kind of cookies whenever she visited, a small detail that said more about the two of them than any long explanation could have. That evening, Jackson and Amelia sat together on the back steps of the garage, in the exact spot where they had first met. Jackson reached into a bag and pulled out 2 whole sandwiches this time. Amelia glanced at him and asked whether he was finally sure he had packed enough. He handed her one fully intact, telling her he had learned that sharing did not always require giving up half of what you had. She smiled but did not unwrap it right away. Instead, she asked whether he might want to join her for dinner that weekend. Nothing formal, no board members, no security detail trailing behind them. Jackson was quiet for a moment before he agreed. Out on the road in front of the garage, a newer version of the Meridian Apex passed by, its cooling system running smooth and silent, none of the old rattle left in it. Jackson heard it but did not bother turning to check the readings anymore. For the first time in years, he let himself simply sit still beside another person without needing to solve anything at all. The small house that had once been surrounded by a wall of engines and suits now held only 2 people sharing lunch on a quiet afternoon, staying together because they wanted to, not because either of them had nowhere else left to go. Every driver deserves a company willing to tell the truth, and every good deed deserves to matter more than the title of the person who receives it. Jackson Reed never set out to be a hero. He simply refused to let a stranger go hungry, and that single choice unraveled a conspiracy built on silence. If this story moved you, remember that kindness costs nothing and sometimes changes everything, for the person who gives it and the person who finally learns to receive it in return.